Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to Neurotech Access workshop on brain-computer interfaces. While I give this workshop, maybe if I can trouble you to hold your questions until the very end, and then we can sort of proceed forward and yeah, this should be quite hopefully useful to you all. So without further ado, this is an introduction into brain-computer interfaces. Why is this so important? Well, I hope that after this workshop, you'll see that potentially it's the next digital revolution akin to what the internet did to people who were maybe like our great-grandpas and grandmas. So let's, shall we? Wait. So on the agenda today, what are brain-computer interfaces? We'll quickly brief over what the idea of a brain-computer interface is, and then we'll compare different approaches to brain-computer interfaces, particularly the different types of physics that are used to elicit brain data from the brain, how EEGs work and why we focus on EEGs today, as well as the limitations of EEGs, and particularly how to start your own brainwave project and what resources we can provide you at Neurotech X to basically find a cool project and just hack it into success. Okay, so without further ado, what is a brain-computer interface? In a nutshell, it is a system that is able to collect data from the brain, interpret it from an analog into a digital basis, and essentially output commands that are useful or not. Really depends on your purpose, but that's the system. The types of BCIs that are out there. Essentially, there's semi-invasive BCIs where first and foremost, you got to almost sort of literally implant an array of electrodes on the surface of the dura, which is literally right underneath the skull. So you don't have to cut into the brain or nothing, so to speak. Pardon my lack of grace in speaking about this. But this is give you a comparison of what's out there. The second is fully invasive brain-computer interfaces. Keeping in mind, this is all very pioneering technology, and right now what I'm talking about is mostly on the cutting-edge academic research side. Essentially, that array of microelectrodes is implanted into the cortex directly in there. They're capable of measuring the precision and activity of one single neuron with relatively quick in a relatively quick sampling rate. So I'm mentioning this because EEGs use a similar physics to it. So I hope you're not too dissuaded by this. But what are the potentials of being able to tap into the brain, get an electrical signal, process it, and then potentially, not potentially, actually transmit back an electrical signal to activate neural functions and change consciousness within the brain itself? There are essentially two major companies and one major serious dude working on this particular type of technology is Theodore Berger. Essentially, these are hippocampal prostheses that you implant into animal brains that give people new knowledge and memory sets. For example, the pioneering work about 10 years ago was Theodore Berger would essentially connect mice brains to a synaptic implanted brain-computer interface, and then the mice would have awareness of mazes where they've never been across, just because the neuron. I won't get too technical into this, but I'll send you guys some research on this if you're, because it's really interesting stuff. There's two companies, Kernel and Neuro-Link. Kernel is basically founded with Theodore Berger. Elon Musk has founded Neuro-Link. Essentially, what they're trying to do is basically implant brain-computer interfaces into the brain to give people very interesting properties. And we'll talk about those soon. But for now, I want to talk about the challenges to implanting computers in your brain, particularly the brain rejects foreign object in the sense that it scars over, the conductivity goes down over time, therefore rendering useless, until we found out good biological ways to have, sort of maybe biological-based computers. Maybe that's beyond the scope of this presentation. So essentially, right now, today, we're not talking about anything invasive. We're just talking about particularly what us as newbies, since this is almost brainwave introduction for newbies, is basically what we can all actually access and start to work with, in the sense that we don't want to take big risks and do anything in our brains. If we can start to work on these immediately, you can literally buy you can buy that in Best Buy and all these online. They're under $500. But we're also going to talk about the physics behind how all of these devices I've shown you, the implant in the brain, all of these work, as well as some research-grade EEGs that don't require you to sort of cut into the skull to get brain data. The signal data is not as good, but it's usable. So here's a nutshell into how the EEGs work. To begin with, each neuron, as it fires, forms basically a potential difference between the synapse and the axon. What I mean to say is that as a neuron is fired at the very up top here, all this sodium sort of forces a bunch of electrons to shoot down this pipe here, and basically sort of release all the whole chain of logic into the brain. But particularly what we are interested in is the fact that a potential voltage has occurred. We're not too interested in the details of what is happening in here for this presentation, but yeah, keep in mind, just whenever there's brain activity, your brain's like an electrical machine. You gotta in essence recognize that EEGs are scanning the surface voltages on the brain. So let's see here. It's a visualization. This is not what EEG data looks like, but it's sort of a visualization. It doesn't really mean much. So in choosing an EEG system, there's quite a few things that you have to particularly be aware of, whether you want to do consumer-grade research, whether you want to do research, like legitimate research, particularly the sampling rate, how quickly can it sample, how many channels, how much coverage does it have on the brain, whether the electrodes are dry or wet. I'll explain what these all mean soon. What are the cost of it, whether it's going to cost you like $20,000 to run your experiment or a couple $100. That's dependent on your hardware system most fundamentally. What are the sensors are included, like motion sensors, heart rate sensors. And I think what's really important is the type of data license that you're going to be able to use. Every single manufacturer has a different type of data contract that they allow you to use. So you got to be prescient in what kind of data license you use. I'll send, well, you guys will have access. I'll message you guys the link to all of the different options to help you see what the best hardware and software based on your actual project is. So keep in mind that there are options out there, and they range from like a couple $100 to about $20,000, $30,000. There. So the fundamental differences between EEGs right now are whether they're wet electrode EEGs. Well, keep in mind, I misspoke. Right now, there's two types of electrodes. There's wet-based electrodes where you need a gel to basically create that conductivity on the surface of the brain. Because if there's not enough conductivity, the signal will not be strong enough to be of any use. That's one approach. It's really nice, but it's got a good signal, but it takes a lot of time to squirt the liquid in there to get a good signal. It's not very economically viable if you're running research on mass. You need a whole whack of data. It's important to have a more quick, easy way to scan people and have relatively similar data. So these are some sensors that sort of like go through your hair and rest on the surface of your scalp. Particularly, I'll I'll send you guys the link too in the description and on where to purchase these and who the suppliers are. Okay. So for the base of these presentations, there are different types of electrode placement systems, but right now we are concerned with the 1020 system. This is mostly the, I would say what is most accepted as the standard electrode placement. So even though it's a really young field, there are practices that go back for decades, and this is one of them. This means essentially where you place the electrodes. And it depends where you place it at different points of interest. Particularly if you're kind of wanting to see how someone is performing as they do a lot of math, they're going to need a lot of prefrontal cortex activity versus someone who's doing something that requires a lot of motor activity or language. So depending on the experiment that you're forming, you need to be recognizing that what you're trying to scan out of the brain is dependent on where you put the electrodes for best placement and what type of hardware you get. So that's pretty key. Otherwise, you're just sort of scanning something and there's just nothing there. The brain's firing somewhere else. Okay. So essentially, how does EEGs work? We've talked a lot about it. We've talked about it inside the brain. We've talked about it on the surface of the brain and outside the brain. But how does it work fundamentally? How does the physics of it work? Basically, there's two main electrodes, two main sources of signal that are very important for us right now. Right? This is the signal node and the reference node. Essentially, we are interested in where the signal node is placed. For example, if I'm interested in what someone's thinking about in math, I would put it in the front of my head. That's where a lot of the math functions tend to happen. And necessarily, the reference node is generally placed around the ear to record all the background noise, and sort of subtracting the two signals leaves you with the resulting signal of the localized source. Ideally, hopefully, that's if you think that math is happening here, then hopefully it's happening there. In any way, you can localize it and use data science to actually figure out quantitatively with good experimental design if there is something or not. So in a nutshell, we're taking the electricity from the scalp, we're amplifying it using on-site hardware. Some other primitive but also useful BCIs like EEGs, they don't have an active amplification system. It's not a bad deal. Depends on how well it's designed. Basically, we take the raw signal, we amplify it, we turn it into a digital format, and then we can start to work with it in the software form for data analysis and, more importantly, pre-processing. Because raw EEG data is really useless. But after you apply a few filters to it, it becomes actually really, I guess, more useful than very useless. I'll put it that way. So here are some of the main particular artifacts that you need to subtract from the noise after you've gathered it from the actual brain through the amplification and through the analog. Basically, once you start working with the raw data, there's eye movements, muscle movements, heart rate, the general electrical background noise, and breathing. So it's really important to algorithmically subtract out these, and I'll talk later about how to identify what these are, and then to subtract it out later on in our slide. So that's just kind of what the data sort of looks like. So what are we doing with this data? Essentially, right now it's just a straight time series, it's a bunch of data, but in order to translate it into a usable format, the convention has been to use an algorithm called a Fourier transform, which essentially takes the data and breaks it down into its fundamental frequencies. Now, this is really hard to understand, especially without a background in mathematics, and I have no idea really how the equation itself works, or Fourier transform. But I believe that this analogy works very well to describe how EEGs are able to analyze the brain function. So imagine that EEGs, that there's a bunch of fish swimming underneath a pond, and these fish are similar to the neuronal activities. With EEGs, you can't really see what's underneath, but you can see the ripples on the surface. So if the fish are swimming really quickly, if there's a lot of neuronal activities, the macro scale properties of the system exhibit a very high frequency signature. Particularly, now this is a really loose analogy. I wouldn't place too much weight on it. It's just sort of to try to wrap your head around the idea of how Fourier transforms and frequency analysis work with EEG data. Particularly, that's really the most that we have to work with at the moment. So essentially, there are kind of like five rough brush strokes where past theorists kind of say, oh boy, these are what gamma, beta, alpha, theta, delta is. Keep in mind that there is no real general lexicon or standardized dictionary of what all of these actually are, in a sense that there's been so much access to data using EEGs, but no way to process the actual machine learning or to elicit patterns from it. So in the past literature, everyone's basically kind of guessing. But in the past 100 years or so, this is kind of what the general brain states are associated with the frequency states. So when your brain is not really fluctuating very much, when your brain is sort of at peace, maybe rhythmically oscillating once every second or so, you would basically be exhibiting delta waves, which is associated in experiments with sleep, meditation, as your brain waves start to become a bit more active. So keep in mind that I don't believe this is really concluded yet. I think this is just a very barbaric approach in how to analyze macro scale brain waves. Because what happens, maybe like 4.02138 hertz has something completely different than 4.089 hertz, but it's all sort of blanketed it. So what we really need to do is take a machine learning perspective to analyze this data. So rather than prescribing it ourselves, we get machine learning to cluster it. So here's where event-related potentials are cool as heck, in the sense that we're essentially in the process of building a lexicon of thoughts, in the sense that what is repeatable, what thoughts are essentially eliciting the same frequencies across the board for all of us. For example, if I stamp my boot, everyone has this particular brainwave that elicits. That is a repeatable command. No, not command, but a repeatable signal. Yeah. So, yeah, so I'll show you why that movement artifact is really important to cancel out. And because right now they've got a brain-computer interface, and it's showing their brain waves in real time right there. So it's going to be passed along, and you guys can all see your brain waves. Excellent. So the idea right now is, I think our generation's job is not to try to pioneer things too much, but is to really isolate and categorize the unique states of minds. So to give you an idea of what I mean, check some of these repeatable signals out. The first is the P300. It literally helps people who can't speak or are paralyzed talk at a lot faster rate, and I'll show you a video of that, an example of some of that research soon. The other is the P50. So when I stamp my foot, that signal that is elicited across all of our brains is generally statistically recognized as the P50. Having thus, these are specific frequency range, and for example, whenever I hit that noise, the P50 will be elicited for maybe like a half a second, and then at a particular frequency. So these are repeatable signals. If I see a face, someone I really care about, then like the N170 or the N170 is sort of like fires in everyone's brain, particularly. Yeah, and that's why we're creating a standardized lexicon of thought based on frequency analysis. So this is the language and the sort of the standard that the people are sort of gravitating towards. Keep in mind, this is all out there. It's all like fresh territory, which is really best territory to pioneer in. Okay, so essentially, why is this field blooming now versus many years ago? We had EEGs for 100 years when a fellow named Hans Berger created it. I think in the early 1900s, but it's only because of machine learning, data science, and really these techniques that allow us to elicit patterns without spending our whole life sort of looking at the data, racking our brains at it. Necessarily, with machine learning, the consumerization of brain-computer electronics, we're seeing these convergent technologies spark a new revolution in products and use cases. And I'll show you what some of those are in a second. But essentially, machine learning lets us, with classifiers, create computer scripts that are useful or useless, depending on what we want them to do, based on repeatable brain commands. Now, it can't read your precise thoughts. Keep in mind, this is extremely rough technology. There is not much statistical reliability in even the devices that are created right now. So they might work, like the videos I'll show you, they'll show brain computers working, but keep in mind, behind the scenes, it only works like 70% of the time, 80% of the time. Unless it's really good. But take everything here with a grain of salt, what I'm about to show you. Okay? Sorry. Yeah, it's a really young field. So essentially, the limitations of EEG, the raw EEG is pretty uninformative, to be frank. Processing EEG can just give you clues, nothing precise. It's really poor signal-to-noise ratio, like horrible, compared to the implantable electrodes. So don't expect much from it, but there is a lot of potential, and here's why. I'll come back to this in a second, but this is one of our co-founders / partners of Neurotech X. Well, that's not the dude, but that's his product. So whenever he thinks of a state of calm, then rather than thinking of flying a helicopter, it ain't that precise. All he's doing is he's saying, "Oh, I'm going to feel calm," and then the EEG recognizes he's feeling calm and then makes it fly. So keep in mind, it's not really flying a helicopter. He's just making a move. It's just an example. But here's another really interesting one that we did up in our Neurotech X hack night. I think this was in San Francisco. But keep in mind, for every one nice film that you do, they probably have like a bunch of other not so good examples. So please don't get your hopes up unnecessarily. Like it's just not going to work. But I'll show you technologies that could make it happen. That is just on the verge, like Dopplers. So here's one that I think that's fantastic in the sense of there's a lot of potential in the technology to help unlock people from really locked in, literally, states of life. Particularly, I want to take a step back away from neurorobotics and talk a bit more about how we can use EEG signals to do something we call neurofeedback, in the sense that by using real-time data and real-time biometric insights, there are many ways to basically potentially accelerate learning itself. That's actually what my company is working on, if anyone is curious about that in the future. Essentially, students have no way to express how they're feeling to a teacher right now. As a lecturer, I have no way to see how everyone's brainwaves are or everyone is reacting, especially on a digital level. So bringing a biometric aspect into this can help bridge that gap between teacher and students. So one second, I'm going to go quite back to this. Right now, even though there are many limitations in EEGs, I want you all to really consider two technologies, particularly one more than the other. The first is what we call functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So rather than taking the electricity from the neurons as I've just described, what FNIRs are actually doing is we shine a burst of light into your brain, and then we see how the blood is flowing through it, what the concentration of blood to oxygen level is in your brain. So if I'm thinking about a cat, the area of my brain where the cat is housed, it consumes more oxygen than other parts of the brain. So by shining a burst of light and receiving back the frequencies of light, you can actually tell what the type of mass and chemistry ratio is in the brain. So essentially, that gives you a much, much better signal-to-noise ratio than EEGs, because rather than being on the surface, you're sort of shining a few centimeters, 2 or 3 centimeters into the brain. But keep in mind, because it requires a blood consumption, it's going to take a 2 to 3 second lag. So your data is not precise, it's not on point like EEGs are. EEGs are lightning whip quick because it's electricity. It's literally lightning going through your brain into the computer. But the fundamental flaw of FNIRs is the fact that you aren't able to go through much hair, because your hair is kind of designed to shield out your brain from radiation. So transcranial ultrasound Dopplers, in my inexperienced opinion, is going to be the future, in the sense that you're able to send a burst of sound clean through hair, clean through the skull, without any interference with much else. There's a lot of cool research there. One thing that I want to leave you off with in this comparison is the fact that none of these interfere with the other. We can utilize multimodal, consumer-grade hardware. I think that's what the next generation of BCI entrepreneurs are going to be involved in, for the fact that the bottleneck right now to the industry is a poor signal-to-noise ratio. But because the fundamental chips and designs of these modalities to actually extract the data from the brain are so easily available, or the chips to build, it's not really rocket science. There's already ultrasound devices, there's already spectroscopy devices. So by combining multimodal approaches with EEGs, FNIRs, and ultrasounds into a nice package like what that Muse has over there that you guys have been playing with, I think that's really going to be the future of BCIs. So before I leave you off, I just want to touch quickly on this one last slide here. And it's really about the different applications of BCIs. Essentially, we're entering in a world where we can use neurofeedback to help people gain more self-mastery over their minds, to give them real-time analysis into how their own brainwaves are doing. That's what a lot of these mindfulness apps are trying to do. Synthetic telekinesis, in the sense that maybe not today, but as we get a better signal-to-noise ratio, as we get more precise hardware, definitely there's no reason why we cannot create true useful brain-computer interfaces with robots controlled efficiently with the brain. Diagnostics, using brain-computer interfaces, we're able to diagnose, well, I don't want to say conclusively, but Alzheimer's, epilepsy, concussions, especially concussions. There's a lot of room to utilize these technologies to look at the brain directly without needing a $200,000-$300,000 equipment, just by using $200-$300 EEG. That democratizes the research and really open sources the innovation. So security, brain-based authentications, there's really countless applications of this. So without further ado, I would like to talk just really quickly about where you can go to get more information about exactly what you need to build your own experiments and actually really understand the details of what this presentation is about. The first is go to the Google Play Store, download the EEG 101. Our chapters have really worked hard to make, in my opinion, the best EEG software tutorial out there. It's just really simple and fun to use. You can even sync it up with whatever device you want and see your own brainwaves as it teaches you about your brainwaves, so things get pretty meta. It's free, like all knowledge should be. The other is Neurotech Edu. Our platform of basically, we're all doing our best to try to get the message out, make all the resources, skills easily accessible to everyone. So this is almost a Wikipedia, particularly for neurotech innovation. So thank you so much for taking the time from your schedules to come here and learn a bit about what this technology is and what it can do. We exist to basically help anyone who's interested in the field succeed however we can. We've got a global network, particularly if anyone needs a hand with any projects or is looking for a team or is interested in the field, just message me. I'd love to connect you with relevant people in the field. Feel free to join our global Slack it's like an open Slack channel, and everyone can basically sort of share their ideas, ask questions. That's the best way to get involved. Just ask questions. Everyone is super supportive in the community. So yeah, and we're all really happy to help. So thank you for the time, and I hope this was useful in some regard. Cool. Awesome. Fantastic. I'm going to see how we can turn on the lights. But yeah, any questions so far? What can I?
Where can I find the channel, the Slack channel?
So everyone who's RSVP'd to the event, I will send you a comprehensive list of all the information such that you don't have to worry about nothing. It'll all be there to like sort of click and so on. To see what software is best for your purpose, what hardware is best. Yeah, Neurotech Edu is so efficient to use. Questions, sir?
Yeah, I was wondering more about the characteristics of the infrared, like what the resolution, spatial resolution, and what the signal noise actually was.
That's one of my favorite questions because it talks about where the future of BCIs are going. Because EEGs, I think, is going to be yesterday's news real quick. There's two main forms of functional near-infrared right now. There's fast and then there's slow wave. In the sense that by emitting light really quickly, like super fast, like at an extremely high resolution, like 5,000 times a second, or as fast as cameras and emitters can emit, we actually have a completely different signal-to-noise signature than if you were to project and use all the energy to project the lights once deep into the brain and then record it back. So if you use the fast FNIR methodology, where you scan the brain really, really quickly with a bunch of bursts of light, then essentially you get a signal-to-noise ratio that's cleaner than EEGs. It's more akin to EEGs because you capture all the different variations of the brain with the EEG just by using light. But with the slow wave, where you just send one deep burst in, you get more signal, but there's a 3-second lag. So it's always there's run as a trade-off in that aspect.
Is that lag, is that because of the biological process and the fact that you're actually measuring blood flow and not activity?
Absolutely, that's 100%. Absolutely. In the localized regions where the thought is stored, say if I think of my dogs right now, I'm like, oh, how are the dogs doing? That area where my dogs are stored is just consuming a lot of energy to actually process the logic of what my dog is to me. It's pretty meta. So in that immediate area and in the localized region, I cannot say anything more without guessing. I don't know.
So it's similar to fMRI in the resolution for it because it's blood flow based.
Yeah, in essence, indeed, blood oxygen based. Oh, sorry?
What is the spatial resolution? Because there's some talk of wanting to get to what they call vertical columns, which would be fractions of a millimeter. And MRI isn't quite there. What is the spatial resolution?
It's not very good. It's only about 2 centimeters. So keeping in mind that this is a really rough estimation. If I project a beam of light here and I'm receiving it here, which is essentially what we're doing, and this is the brain, the light needs to travel across this whole path. So there's a lot of imprecision. So in order to actually recognize where the localized region is happening, we need to actually have sensors all over and use topological recalculation to map the brain. So it's a very, very rough estimate, but it's still, in terms of classification accuracy on brain-controlled tasks, by using blood-based ultrasound and FNIRs, you're able to get much better control of robots and what we call classification accuracy than just EEGs alone. But I'm thinking, why not combine all of that? That would sell like hotcakes. So if anyone here in our digital audience is doing that, they should innovate for us all.
So is there anyone working on consumer-grade magnetoencephalograms, as they are also able to detect slightly different things than EEGs?
Not that I am familiar with. There are people working on hacker grade. There's really 3 types of BCIs. Consumer grade, which looks real nice, like Apple stuff. There's hacker grade, which is really, really ugly but extremely useful. And then there's research grade, which is just really, really expensive and high fidelity. So in terms of hacker grade, there are magnetic-based BCIs, but not that I know of in terms of consumer. The only consumer-based brain-computer interfaces there are now is EEGs. Just because it's so cheap to produce it, you just put a couple of amplifiers and, but that's a bit above me, to be honest. You had a question there, sir?
Yeah. Do you know if anybody's using the dry electrodes for clinical, feedback?
That's a really good question, and I think most people are going to start transitioning. Sorry, a lot of coffee. I got an acid reflux. A lot of people are going to start transitioning, especially in the research field, towards dry-based electrodes, because now we're seeing the rise of, say, nano-based polymers that are rubbery, that you can just print with ultra-high conductivity using carbon-infused rubberized materials that people can just 3D print in their lab. So what this allows is this technological innovation means that like wet EEGs are just really, really ineffective. So there's been comparisons. For example, this silver-tipped, this silver chloride-tipped rubberized polymer that you see on the left here. I don't have one here, damn. Sorry. But essentially, the comparison of the fidelity of the signal to wet EEGs, they have a side-by-side comparison of the raw data and of the wet electrodes standardized and this new cognionics flex sensors, that's what they call it. And it seems pretty, just from visually, it seems pretty accurate. They say statistically it's kind of the same. But if you ask me, it's like there's already not much data to begin with. You're trying to see how the fish are swimming underneath the pond. So it doesn't matter if you have 1,000K camera, as long as it's good enough to see and measure the amplitudes. But that's really exactly. That's why the title is really loose analogy. I knew I was going to get in trouble for that. Ignore the fish example. It'll get you in trouble.
Can you tell us the companies?
What's
the name of this company?
Cognionics. It'll be in the spreadsheet of comparison of devices and electrodes that we compiled that I'll send to you in the message. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the projects that are going on in the network, neurotech, sort of the big, broad brushstrokes of what projects are out there?
Absolutely. Right now, one of the main projects is recognizing that the field is so immature that there's really a lack of any standardized methodologies. So Neurotech Agile is right now where we're focusing and investing most of our community volunteer efforts time into trying to build up a solid Wikipedia of all the different factors in neurotechnology. And in terms of the actual projects itself, I invite everyone to go to the NeuroTechX page. We have a list of projects, and I'll be sure to include that in the documents and too.
Okay.
Let's see, I don't know if you said much about transcranial stimulation.
Oh yes, transcranial stimulation. Very good question, sir. So transcranial stimulation is essentially, it's not covered in this talk, but the idea is one can essentially prime the brain to do certain functions, to resonate in certain frequencies. If you just sort of barbarically inject that frequency into the brain using electrical brute force, I don't really think it's a very appropriate approach unless it's done on the intercortical level where you actually have an understanding of what each neural synapse is doing. Then it limits the deployment to really paralyzed or people who need that surgery. So in terms of transcranial stimulation, which is basically zapping, sending energy through electricity at specific frequencies into the brain to alter the state of consciousness. Now, DARPA, for example, has been able to accelerate learning in the sense of, I think it's like 30 or 40% for any given task, I think a piano shooting, it's DARPA. And by pre-charging the brain to be able to, here's how it works. Here's an expert. Let's scan the expert's brain while they're doing it, recognize what frequency patterns, then you correlate the frequency patterns with the task, and then you inject that frequency pattern into the new students.
Seriously.
Yeah.
That's the matrix.
What's going to happen?
Statistically, it shows
It works.
a result, but
Wow.
I do not believe that it's important. It's the right approach. But that is a subjective issue because it's important to think about what the ethical issues are of having an uncontrolled.
There's also a severe risk of seizures from brain stimulation in that manner.
Yeah, absolutely. But it does help tremendously in, say, Parkinson's, from what I understand, in the sense that people who have Parkinson's, when they have a steady, I'm not so sure what frequency or amplitude of TCDS and electricity flowing to the brain, they're able to gain control on all of their hands.
You're talking about deep brain
That's
stimulation,
typically,
right?
they typically implant.
They
deep
implant
brain
that,
one.
yeah.
Oh,
Versus
you are correct. That sorry about that. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
But I think 100% deep brain stimulation do Parkinson's. But I believe I read there might be just transcranial stimulation might be effective if I somehow recall correctly. Right?
Yeah,
Nice.
also
Because
use
it's uncertain.
depression and anxiety and stuff like that, they use DDS to treat that. It's been effective.
The deep brain stimulation has been used for depression and also Huntington's because Huntington's hits the same motor areas as like Parkinson's, but they stimulate slightly differently.
That's so cool. I actually have not much idea about that, stimulating the brain. So I cannot speak there, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's more. Often, if you have a magnetic field in a coil and you change the magnetic field very rapidly, it creates a voltage that discharges a portion of the brain. And so you can do things, for example, tell if people are forming a thought and then, you can destroy the thought or destroy, so it helps you understand the brain. But I saw this thing for example, in a museum in Japan where you put something behind your ear and it destroyed your inner ear and people would just fall immediately. You think that your inner ear, if your brain lost its signal, it would sort of be like a log and maybe you come over slowly.
Wow.
Literally, you see these people walking as a
Wow.
it's good. But I also heard that they do things, for example, migraines or something where there it's a big discharge anyway, so then you can sometimes stop migraines from happening.
This is so cool. Would you guys be interested in a second workshop where we get an expert or two or a panel to talk? Because right now we're talking about how to read the brain, but if we can talk, maybe another second panel we can do bring in experts who know about the subject, about how to write into the brain and alter consciousness.
Yeah, theoretically, we're going to need output that's going to be linguistic and input that's sensory. Those are the two, like what we're trying to turn it into in the end.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
We're going to need our output to be linguistic, that is, we express in language into the digital space, and we sense it as our senses. That's when it's going to be the most natural to us.
Yeah,
Everything is to get us to that.
I think this whole field is really going to redefine the philosophy of language and semantics. So rather than having my thoughts shot at you using sound, to take my thoughts and process it based at its roots into meaning, and to transmit that weighted
machine learning classify it to you, such that you would just know exactly what but I don't know. I think that's just my imagination going on.
Deconceptualization levels, there's also greater dimensionality levels where you put more restrictions on it.
Yeah,
and that's basically how you know how. But yeah, it's going to be really cool.
It's quite an interesting field there. So that's why we really need a lot of young pioneers and old pioneers who have experience to basically come into this industry and say, how do we see that there's so many different bottlenecks, and how do we basically build the new internet, the new computer, rather than processing or logic through our hands? How do we unlock the power of true a third limbic system, so to speak, without cutting to the brain? But that's a personal choice.
Words on a lot.
Those thought categories that you had up there, are those in English or in all languages?
These guys.
The N, no, the N.
This.
Yeah, thanks.
All languages.
Really?
Because it's wow, it's got a bit lightheaded. Oh yeah, the F400. See, I didn't have enough oxygen to my brain, so I didn't think as fast. But yeah, basically, words are meaning, conceptual meaning, language, so rough brush stroke, just like auditory stimulus. When someone's in complete silence, you won't really see the P500. But the moment any auditory stimulus happens, then you see a peak of the P500, and then the brain's like, oh, that's the P500, oh, that sort of evens out. It's very interesting. It's really meta to think about your brain waves, especially as you guys have seen looking at your brain waves while you think about your brain waves. So yeah, any last questions?
Yeah, how is this defined? The P500 or P300, for example, is it certain amplitude for a certain duration? How is it defined?
That's exactly it. Amplitude. The unique characteristics that define event-related potential is the amplitude, the duration, and the frequencies. So it might be like multiple frequency patterns. So this is why rather than taking almost like a barbaric approach and saying, oh, it's only 4, I think any rote machine learning classifier worth its weight is going to get it worth its weight. It is going to essentially break down all the frequencies into like maybe 0.01, 0.02, 0.03, just a big whack, just a giant neural network that will run. That might be a better way than to cluster it before as previous theorists had to, because all they saw was the signal on a piece of paper.
So would it be like, the signal would be like the difference between a signal that in sound waves, like a drum beat versus a guitar string strike?
I believe that in that case, that particular signal will be quite similar. I'm not sure if the P of these event-related potentials differentiate between the actual phenomenon. So keep in mind, that's why this whole technology is so early. All you get are really rough clues. You don't get anything precise with EEGs.
Well, people's EEGs are pretty similar across people. So like if you were to look at my P300 over and over, it's pretty consistent. You have like a pretty nice profile over time. Yeah.
Across devices?
Depending, yeah, that's the other thing, your signal quality. Yeah, if I'm working with the same device, then I've been staring at people's brainwaves for the last 3 years. So I can kind of identify people's again.
Different people have different signatures?
Not really.
No?
Like they're all sort of, so P300 is a positive going wave around 300 milliseconds for everyone.
Yeah.
They can go anywhere from 300 to maybe 700, depending on age. You'll think
Right.
your reaction time gets longer as you get older.
Okay.
Unfortunately, they're all similar. Yeah, so everyone's kind of similar, but you can have a little bit, the profiles can kind of look, like yours might look a little bit different than mine, but it has similar characteristics. Yeah.
So is it like a standard distribution around 300 is the?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And how much variability they can get experience between devices?
Yeah, that's, it can even be variability within the same device, depending on like how much person had that day, and how much alcohol they had, and how much sleep, and how much they're sweating if you're using gel-based electrodes. So yeah, there can be quite a bit of variability still. So that's why it's so hard with machine learning, of like, where does it fall into the classifier?
If you measure the reaction time for the day, would it somewhat correlate with their rate of P300? So you were mentioning like reaction time for it. As they get older, it gets slower and whatnot. Would you see a similar thing for reaction time when you do the cooler test?
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you see a similar kind of thing with that sort of stuff? You were measuring it before?
Yeah, so if you're, we've seen like comparison studies, like if you're 20 to 30 years old, you have usually a pretty fast reaction. So P300 is usually an attention grabbing. So it might be, if you're listening to the same tones and then you have a higher frequency tone you hear, you'll see this P300 reaction. But it has to be about 20% of the time is an oddball sort of effect that you get this reaction.
Absolutely. I think the trick here is really have a well-designed experiments that let you test the variability across every individual. So if it's just one person, it's not really repeatable. Maybe if it's just for that person, but if everyone is having that particular frequency recorded, so designing your experiments across a larger population set is extremely important to identify which signals are, if you're trying to find ERPs, you sort of see across different individuals, so you're not getting that selection bias of choosing just one person and like focusing on their brain and maybe have coffee or the experiment goes on your belly. This one, because many factors, the trick of EEG in sum, I want to leave you all with this. There are many factors that are not very precise in EEGs in everything, but overarching, if you just sort of model the whole, take a step back and model it as a whole, that's where you get more results. And that's really the state at which BCIs are at right now. So there's a lot of potential. Can I give you one last question?
Would creating control constants within that isolate data with the data you raise?
Maybe you can elaborate an example.
A control constant. Say normally you're doing a study of an entire brain and this person here is missing 500 grams off their left front. Could that isolate? Okay, well within this system it happens this way. Make a simpler system and then let you bring that knowledge back.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key to any robust experiment is to have not just a diverse participant set to scan their brains, but also the control variables to see here's how people are acting normally, and here's how people are acting when you want them to do something. Well, thank you again for your time, and hope you guys come back.
Yeah, feel free to stick around and chat. I know I'd like to a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah, please.
Yeah.